We are back with the original Star Wars. Did you ever wonder why the destruction of a rooftop dish stopped a whole rebel ship and not just their TV reception? Did C-3PO really always have a silver leg, or was that in a different dimension? And why do the droids end up separated but alive after clearly walking straight into a big explosion? I will talk about this and more in the second episode of Parsec by Parsec. Join me, and together we can explore the movie as creator and fan. Hi and welcome back to my podcast. I'm Joel from Exceedingly Excited and this is Parsec by Parsec. Last time I gave you a not so quick rundown of who I am and how this podcast came to be, so this time I'm gonna try to get into the nitty-gritty a little faster. As I explained last time, in this episode I'll cover the second half of our first 5 minutes of the original Star Wars movie, or episode 4 A New Hope as it is called now. So come inside and please take off your shoes, because we're gonna go into the very first interior scene of the movie. We last saw that radar dish on top of the Tantive V4 explode, and now we are inside the blockade runner and look down a corridor with a grey floor and white walls that shake, probably due to the direct hit we saw the ship take just now. An alarm sound starts wailing. In the background, the corridor bends to the left, and as the camera pulls back, doors become visible, one left, one right. 3 robots, or as we will learn later, droids, are moving along the corridor with the camera. In the center we have what looks like the trash can in my bathroom, you know, these swing bins with a hemisphere on top, but with flat legs on the sides, and due to its movement we can already tell that it's on wheels. A golden droid of humanoid shape walks sideward behind it, and another droid of the same model, but with silver plating behind that. I've described them as if we didn't know them, but even if you don't have anything to do with Star Wars, not that I could relate, chances are that you have seen the first 2 before. It is of course R2-D2 and C-3PO. What about the third one, you ask? Well, I'll describe what happens a little further and then we will go back for the details. Next, we see a couple of guys with blasters and interesting helmets run through another corridor from right to left, and the camera follows them for a moment. We then either see the same guys or more guys wearing the same kind of clothes running around a corner, before we are back with the 3 droids who also just rounded a corner. While they move toward us, another blast hits the ship and C-3PO asks R2-D2, "Did you hear that?" R2 only makes a beeping noise, something like beep boop beep beep, and C-3PO replies, "They've shut down the main reactor. We'll be destroyed for sure. This is madness." R2 beeps again, "Beep," and some more that is a little harder to imitate. Now we get a glimpse at our guys behind the droids and we see that they run in the opposite direction as the droids. Also, the silver humanoid droid goes into a door to our left, leaving R2 and 3PO. We get more guys rounding a corner and now we see where they are all headed as they begin to take cover in door frames, pointing their blasters at the door at the end of their corridor. Quick cut back to 3PO who, apathetically more than anything, states, "We're doomed." R2 beeps an answer and 3PO adds, "There'll be no escape for the princess this time," and "What's that?" as some clanking noises from the ship's hull can be heard. All the armed crewmen are now aiming at the door, looking around confused and worried at the noises as well. We cut to an exterior shot of the Devastator's underbelly, pulling in the blockade runner to the same docking bay with a retaining clamp we saw earlier. Inside again, first the 2 robots and then our door holders look up, seemingly following the sounds from on top of the ship with their eyes. We get a close-up on one of them, an older gentleman whose gaze shifts from the ceiling to the door everyone is pointing their guns at, and his face changes from uncertainty to a grim readiness as he raises his gun a little more. We see a tense back and forth of the door and the waiting gunman until bright, magnesium-like flames burst from the sides of the door, producing a lot of smoke. We glimpse the ready gunman again, and the door finally explodes in orange flames, and parts of it fly through the corridor, trailed by smoke that obscures what's behind it. Let's stop here and see what we have. Firstly, let me mention something that connects back to the last episode. 3PO states, "They've shut down the main reactor. We'll be destroyed for sure. This is madness." It's a little unclear whether he means that the enemy attacks caused the main reactor to shut down, or whether he thinks that the Tantive crew did. Since he points out that they could be destroyed as a result of the reactor shutdown and calls that madness, one might conclude that he is actually talking about the crew. And it turns out that this is probably the case because I found a schematic of the blockade runner which has an interesting detail. The radar dish that we saw being destroyed in the last frame of our previous episode is indicated as the sensor array here and described as follows. Quote, "The primary sensor array collects environmental and navigational data. Because the array is positioned on a fin above the main reactor, damage to the array and fin can cause vibrations that overload the reactor, which must then be shut down, effectively crippling the ship." Unquote. So as you can see, he almost certainly means that the crew themselves shut down the reactor, even though they didn't have much of a choice. This also explains why the destruction of the radar dish indeed doomed the Tantive and its personnel by rendering the vessel immobile. Who in the maker's name approved this ship design though is anyone's guess. By the way, since we're talking about the explosion that rocks the ship, how exactly was the shaking effect achieved? With all the practical effects and complicated processes used in creating the movie, one could think that they did something similar to Christopher Nolan's Inception, where they built a whole corridor that could be rotated to make the collapse of the dream look as real and mind-boggling as possible at the same time. However, since Star Wars began with a limited budget and they only needed one explosion impact, they probably rather took the Blair Witch Project route and literally shook the camera. To test this theory, I stabilized the scene and looked at the droids reacting to the impact. Both the humanoid droids stumble a bit, but if you look closely, their reaction doesn't fully line up and R2 doesn't react at all, since that would have been way more complicated to achieve. Another thing I want to point out is a goof in this scene, although the error is not only in the movie but stems from the script itself. As I described, the droids and crew react to clanking and other sounds seemingly coming from on top of the craft before the enemies break through the door. What are the sounds supposed to be though? Tension in the hull of the ship maybe? Well, the shooting script says, quote, "Tension mounts as loud metallic latches clank and the scream of heavy equipment are heard moving around the outside hull of the ship," unquote. Earlier script versions speak even more specifically about metallic footsteps. But remember, the Tantive is only pulled into the bigger ship after the sounds are heard, and that's not just due to editing but is stated as such in the shooting script. But how can anyone be heard moving on top of the spacecraft at this point? I don't know why they chose to change it, but as it turns out, up until the fourth revised draft of the script, the Tantive was overtaken by the Star Destroyer first, and only then the noises were heard. They must have switched the scenes without taking implications fully into account and hence causing a bit of confusion. While the sounds could be explained as the hull of the ship being influenced by the bigger ship's tractor beam, the reactions of the droids and crew clearly suggest that they follow some kind of footsteps with their eyes until the attackers are outside the door in front of them, so I would chalk this one up to a little mishap. Moving on, as can already be seen in the very first interior shot of Star Wars ever, C-3PO's right leg and knee joint are actually painted silver, not gold. Why do I point that out? Well, this fact is disputed by some in connection to a phenomenon called the Mandela Effect. This name was established in 2010 by a woman called Fiona Broom, who falsely remembered that Nelson Mandela, the South African anti-apartheid revolutionary and later president of South Africa, died in prison during the 1980s, when in fact he died in 2013. Broom, however, doesn't think she remembers the facts incorrectly, but rather that it is possible to somehow shift into a parallel dimension, and these kind of false memories are actually a sort of residue of that happening. Meaning people who experience such a dimension shift might still remember some events as they went down in their original dimension, as opposed to their different twin events in our current dimension. This theory caught on online, and there are countless people talking about different alleged examples of the Mandela Effect and collect more and more of them. There are at least 2 in connection with Star Wars, and one of them is that some people remember C-3PO as being completely golden in the original trilogy. My take on it is this. I'm just as fascinated by crazy theories as the next guy, probably even a whole lot more as your average next guy. I love to go down a good rabbit hole, and there's no place like the internet to do it. There even were crazy theories everyone brushed off in the past that actually turned out to be true. Look at MKUltra, for example. And for those who haven't heard of it, just Google it, because explaining it would bring us a little too much of course here. Anyway, while the Mandela Effect has some interesting coincidences, that's basically it. When confronted with something like that, I usually turn to Occam's razor, a problem-solving principle that Wikipedia quotes with, "Entities should not be multiplied without necessity," or more simply, the simplest explanation is usually the right one. With studies already having shown how bad human memory often is, and even how easily false memories could intentionally be planted in tests, what scenario do you think is more likely? That people remember certain details and events incorrectly, or that they actually shifted to a parallel universe? As for the collective false memory component of it, for most Mandela Effect candidates, ample reasons can be found for why they are probably falsely remembered. To somehow find our way back to our scene, let's take 3PO's leg as an example. I know Star Wars was the movie people watched more than once in a cinema and later obsessed over details, so they at least had a chance to notice the odd silver leg. And they did. If you read up on the topic, many say they wondered for years and decades since the very beginning what might have happened to his original leg. Back in the day, arguing with your friends about it was basically your only option. There were no YouTubers with ready theory videos on their hands yet. Other people might have just seen the movie once, and the leg of some droid is maybe not the most relevant detail in a brand new cinema hit with groundbreaking effects, a little more spectacular than silver paint. For everyone who watched it on VHS on a crappy tube TV until the DVD release in the 2000s, be honest, would you really have noticed something like that without even looking for it? I doubt it. Point in case, Anthony Daniels, the actor who played 3PO, recalled in an interview that the stills photographer on the Tatooine set, who had photographed him for days, asked him on the last day why the leg was suddenly silver, cause he hadn't noticed before. Wait. Was that the exact day the photographer shifted to another dimension? No, I'm joking. The problem is, there's no disproving it, because you can show believers as much material of C-3PO with a silver leg from back then or what have you, without convincing them, because they don't think it's a cover-up of past events of this dimension, but another dimension altogether. Sure, this dimension always had the silver leg, but not their dimension. So yeah, take a look at the Mandela Effect if you want to, but take it with a big grain of salt, or if you want to go down an online rabbit hole where people remember crazy stuff and obsess over it, but it actually turns out they remembered it correctly when nobody believed them for decades, just look into the topic of lost media instead. Believe me, that's way more interesting. Anyway, the leg is silver and always was, case closed. Well, actually it was golden before. In episode 2 and 3, which take place before our scene. Maybe these people previously lived a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away during the Clone Wars, and that's where the memory stems from? Who knows? Speaking of silver, have you ever asked yourself who that other protocol droid following R2-D2 and C-3PO in the beginning is? According to the current canon taken from the 2017 book Ultimate LEGO Star Wars, this is U-3PO, another 3PO series protocol droid we otherwise know nothing about. However, this name originated from what is now called Legends material, namely the 1995 A New Hope Limited set of the Star Wars customizable card game. Interestingly, the flavor text of the respective card explained that U-3PO was an unwitting Imperial spy. Previously part of the diplomatic corps of the Royal House of Alderaan, the droid sent a so-called S-threat signal to the Empire, which allowed the Devastator to track the Tantive IV through hyperspace, which should otherwise have not been possible at this point in time. And even though this currently is not canon anymore, it theoretically could become canon again in the future. Since the release of the standalone movie Rogue One: A Star Wars Story, we do know what exactly happened up to moments before the start of the events of this movie, but not how Vader could follow the consular ship through hyperspace. There is a canonic short story called Ramus of the 2017 anthology From a Certain Point of View, which explains that the Tantive's hyperdrive was leaking and left a trail, but I really like the idea of a compromised protocol droid. Maybe a combination where a hidden subroutine forces him to manipulate the hyperdrive against his will, so to speak? This could be done as an animated short or something where we see the end of Rogue One and the beginning of Episode 4 tied together through the eyes of U-3PO, who literally creates a leak to lead Vader to the position of the Tantive. Put it on Disney+, I'd watch it. Also, if you noticed and wondered why I keep saying who when referring to droids, on one hand, the droids in Star Wars often have very human characteristics to the point where they are afraid, heroic, vindictive, etc. On the other hand, in Legends there even was a gender programming for more complex droids, and we see differences between male and female voices and body shapes. While that doesn't necessarily give them self-awareness or a gender identity, we bond with our pets in real life a lot and call them he and she. Admittedly, they actually are male or female. It's not that far-fetched to humanize the droids due to their portrayal in Star Wars. Now that we've identified U-3PO, who had a male programming in Legends in case you wondered, as the probable traitor who leaked to the Empire, we never see him again after going into that door and we can move on. Or can we? Since C-3PO and U-3PO are basically the same costume with two different paint jobs, let's talk about how that came to be and who's in it. The script describes C-3PO as, quote, a tall, slender robot of human proportions. He has a gleaming bronze-like metallic surface of an Art Deco design, unquote. Probably even more than most other elements of Star Wars, the whole portrayal of C-3PO was strongly influenced by Ralph McQuarrie's concept art. Anthony Daniels, the actor who famously portrayed and voiced C-3PO and still does in movies, shows and games, said in an interview that when he came in to audition, he had no interest to do a sci-fi movie, but when he was about to leave, he saw one of McQuarrie's artworks of C-3PO and instantly fell in love with the character. So this artwork seems to be worth taking a look at. First of all, C-3PO was described as having an Art Deco design since the rough draft. So what does that mean exactly? Wikipedia defines Art Deco as, quote, a style of visual arts, architecture and design that first appeared in France just before World War I. It combined modern styles with fine craftsmanship and rich materials. During its heyday, Art Deco represented luxury, glamour, exuberance, and faith in social and technological progress, unquote. The Chrysler Building and Empire State Building in New York are examples of Art Deco, and I show some more on screen. Specifically, the Bugatti Aerolite from 1936 looks like a car version of C-3PO to me. But George Lucas gave McQuarrie a more specific basis for the look than just Art Deco. He wanted the droid to look like a male version of the Maschinenmensch from Fritz Lang's 1927 movie Metropolis, and the similarities certainly do show. C-3PO's plating was described as bronze-like in the script, but finally ended up golden in the movie, which fits Art Deco even better. The concept of faith and social progress also seems to make sense, given that he is a protocol droid whose main functions are human-cyborg relations, as he likes to introduce himself. Although it should probably be more like biological being-cyborg relations, since he was built before the human-centric period of the Galactic Empire. In the concept art that convinced Daniels, McQuarrie actually did a very good job of creating a male Maschinenmensch of the same style. Early C-3PO has a similar head with knob-like elements where human ears would be, as well as on top, connected by a crosspiece, making him look like he's wearing over-ear headphones. Another stripe leads from the top of his head down the face, ending in a kind of nose. Only the machine mensch features a more human-like mouth and eyes, where 3PO only has 2 round holes and an oblong one. 3PO's shoulders are a little flatter and have epaulets. Aside from featuring a stylized male chest instead of a female one, the torso is really similar, specifically a definite area leading from the solar plexus over the stomach, ending slightly tapered in the crotch. Both robots' arms have seams where upper and lower arms and hands connect, with ornaments on lower arms and hands. The upper legs are reminiscent of medieval armor, with a prominent overlap over the hips, and both upper and lower legs are ornamented. With the concept art being that similar, the actual costume kept much of the general style with a few notable differences. Mainly, the knee joints were changed into hinges, only bending in one dimension, the midsection is exposed instead of fully plated, showing some wiring on top of black covering, and the head lost the nose stripe but gained the signature lamp eyes instead of simple holes. What's interesting about the Art Deco design in connection with the droids is that the other one's name, R2-D2, sounds somewhat similar to Art Deco. R2-D2, Art Deco? I don't know, maybe I'm just hearing things, but they're similar to me. For R2, there is however another possible name origin I read about. Supposedly during post-production of American Graffiti, an earlier George Lucas movie from 1973, someone asked for the real number 2 of the second dialogue track, which came out as, "Could you get R2-D2 for me?" And Lucas liked the sound of that and wrote it down. While the droids had different names in earlier scripts, namely A2 and C3, he might have seen that jotted down R2-D2 again and used it. However, it's always tough to know which of these accounts from decades ago are actually true, especially because some authors tend to prefer a good origin story over the dry truth sometimes. Speaking of droid names, what do you call a protocol droid with all the wiring exposed under a clear hull? C-3PO. I like to think Dad Vader would be proud of me, although he'd probably choke me since that's his kind of humor. Anyway, let's get into how that costume was made. Anthony Daniels' body was cast in plaster, and with the resulting mold a figure was created. Liz Moore, a sculptor, then created the robot suit around that with sculpting clay. Apparently a few different heads were considered, and George picked the only one Daniels initially didn't like. They built and fitted the costume parts over time. Most were made out of thin plastic and quite difficult to get into due to the stiffness, which is why up to 6 people had to help Daniels dress. Underneath the plating parts he wore tights, a leotard, a hood and gloves, all black. The eyes are see-through in the middle and light up via 6 batteries in the blade on the costume's back, connected with a wire routed over the head. I want to save a little bit of C-3PO's making for the next episodes, but one thing I read that can be seen in the Tantive hallway scenes is that there seem to be changes in the costume's weathering. That is basically the artificial aging process of costumes and props. When such things are supposed to look used, prop and costume makers dirty them up for appropriate realism according to the in-world logic. With 3PO, he looks rather shiny in most wide shots, but stained in close-ups. This was not my own finding, but I certainly see it. However, I can't tell whether the costume was actually different for the scenes or just appears that way. Though I read 2 more things that probably explain it. Firstly, they allegedly only filmed 2 takes for all the Tantive hallway shots, but utilized 6 cameras and cleverly used multiple angles of the same footage to portray all the necessary action. If this is true, then the wide shots of the droids were included in that footage, but I think they shot the close-ups separately. And secondly, I read that they had to dull C-3PO with dirt in certain scenes because the camera or crew were reflected in the shiny surfaces. In frames which I will point out later, this is still the case. But here I suppose they weathered the costume and then shot the close-ups, which accounts for the differences in appearance. But if you save time and money by doing such a scene in 2 takes, these scenes were filmed last when time and money were quickly running out, then you don't reshoot for some shiny surface continuity, I guess. Now I want to get into our other star droid, R2-D2, next episode, but there's one last thing about the Silver Protocol droid, U3PO, that bugged me and I wanted to get into before we let him disappear through that door. Since we only see U3PO in scenes with his golden counterpart, who was in that costume? Let's quickly look that up and I'm stuck. In the credits? Nope. Back in the day they credited only the main characters and a few others, 25 altogether in this case. Okay, no problem, IMDb has our backs in such cases, listing a whopping 80 more uncredited people in tons of smaller roles like certain aliens, stormtroopers, voices of stormtroopers, and so on. Even some droids who show up later for a few seconds, some I guarantee you many people wouldn't even have guessed had people in them, like the Gonk droid. But at least one guy is still missing, U3PO. Wikipedia? No. Fanwikis? Nope. Has anyone even ever asked before who played that droid? Reddit? Help me out here? Nope. Most search results are either his Lego alter ego or toy reviews for action figures. And if even the fans don't know, heck, don't even ask, who to ask then? Anthony Daniels himself, I guess? Well, I got a lot of my info on C3PO from a 50-minute long Wired interview with Daniels, where he talks extensively about the role, the costume making process, and so on. How it was modeled specifically on his body and still was a pain in the assembly process and took hours to get into. And not once did he mention another actor or, I don't know, Johnny Boy from the props department or whatever poor soul had to do the same, plus probably not having it refitted, but using the same Daniels mold but minus the lifelong fame? Guess not. Come on, I thought this was the internet. Am I just too stupid to Google? So, currently I'm planning to put out a bounty to find this person. Man, woman, small Wookiee, whoever played that droid. I want a name, Mando. Little extra, if you can bring me proof. I'll probably do a little video on that later. Let me stop you right there, Joel from script recording. Here's Joel from video editing, and as it turns out, I was too stupid to Google. I recently found out that Wendy Leach, the stunt double for Anthony Daniels in the C3PO costume, also played U3PO. In my defense, I must say that back when I wrote the script, which was actually a few months ago, I researched the topic for quite a while. It surprises me that Wendy Leach as the person in the U3PO costume is not mentioned in any wiki I consulted, despite having a behind-the-scenes section, and neither on IMDb or in the 50-minute interview about the costume. Finally, I randomly searched in Google again and found a little detail that finally led me to the truth, and later also a comment to that effect on a Reddit post about U3PO, which didn't discuss the actor though. It's one of those things which seems to be a big mystery, but quite obvious once you know the truth. On one hand, using the stunt double just makes a ton of sense, but before that I actually wasn't even aware C3PO had or needed one. On the other hand, I searched for pictures of U3PO beforehand and didn't find any clue. But when I searched for Wendy Leach after the fact, I instantly found her autographs on pictures of C3PO, but also U3PO, as well as the U3PO trading card I mentioned. Well, I guess hindsight is 20/20, but at least I saved those precious bounty credits. Anyway, Joel from video editing out, and back to the studio. Now, before we move on, let's briefly look at the corridor design. First of all, I asked myself what all these white panels on the walls are for. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any in-universe explanation, but this time at least I found one other person who asked the same question. Nobody knew, but guesses in the replies ranged from manual controls, emergency life support systems, medical and other supplies, vents, maintenance access points, or, as one poster suggested, lockers to store backpacks and lunchboxes. Another poster brought up forgetting his locker combination, leading to a third person imagining the radio call-out, "We need an Alderaanian janitor to section AA23 to open a locker for some cadet who jammed their locker up again." Naturally, this is my favorite option. A second design element of the corridors actually seems to be more of a design flaw or a goof. Throughout this whole scene we can see several doors, all with the same white, thick, tube-like frame that is not leveled with the floor. Usually I'd now make jokes about how stupid and impractical that design is, but I guess that's not necessarily true. First of all, the design might have to do with maintaining air pressure in case of a partially damaged hull by sealing off the damaged area, and second of all, the CR-90 Corvette is supposed to be customizable through modules, and these door frames could be part of the module connections. But whatever the reason might be, these doors are either impractical and the cause of a goof, or have an as of yet unseen feature. Because roughly at 4 minutes 14 seconds, we see R2-D2 and C-3PO pass through one of those doors and go across the corridor and into the opposite door. But even 3PO, with his mincing steps, but most definitely R2 on his wheels, should have problems going over the raised frame, but neither of them has any problems. On the production side of things, I found a set photo where you can see that they just took out part of the frame, and for an in-universe explanation, well, I suppose it automatically lowers that part of the door. Not that it's even relevant, it's just something that stood out to me when I examined the background. Finally, it's time to talk about our helmet-wearing guys who rush to point their guns at the door at the end of a corridor. They wear grey cargo pants or combat pants and light blue long-sleeve shirts with collars. Additionally, black calf-length boots, black vests and brown belts with big silver buckles. And of course, their signature helmets. For everyone who only listens to this, do you know these long-tailed bike helmets that are supposed to make you more aerodynamic? It's pretty much that with a few other features. They have a dark-tinted visor on the forehead part, however nobody seems to use it, although they probably know that they will face the scariest enemy of their career in a couple of seconds. So that leads me to believe that the visors wouldn't protect against blaster fire or anything similar, but probably light and things like dust, I suppose. It seems the main body and tail part of the helmet are not of one cast, but the tail was rather attached to the helmet later and could serve as additional neck protection. The helmets are held in place with a black strap with a white chin guard. Lastly, the helmet features a little box with an antenna on the left side, which is likely an integrated comlink. Whenever this antenna is on the right side in a shot instead, this indicates the footage was flipped. But who are these bike helmet boys exactly? Note that I originally wanted to make a joke where I mixed up Tour de France with the Force to Tour de Force until I discovered that this actually is an existing expression I never heard before. Oh, the joys of doing content in a second language. Anyway, originally people only knew that these guys were probably the crew of the Tantive, since the captain we see later wears a version of the same outfit himself, and you could interpret that they must be rebels, but that's not exactly a job description. Although Vader ultimately doesn't believe them, they claim to be on a diplomatic mission, so that should be their official purpose. A 2018 expansion of an officially licensed Star Wars tabletop game from Fantasy Flight Games had them as fleet troopers, but that doesn't tell us much more. However, the ultimate visual guide to Rogue One: A Star Wars Story finally identified them as Alderaanian Consular Security. So they came from the same planet as Princess Leia herself, which might explain why they are exclusively human. The blaster pistols they are using are DH-17s, but I will talk about their origins in a later episode. Another thing I want to take a look at is the claim that the whole preparation and fight scene was filmed in only 2 takes. I'd like to identify which shots are from which take, etc., but since this relies on visuals even more than the rest of what I'm talking about, I decided to do a separate video on that for YouTube. Now I will describe the last part of our 5-minute segment before we get into the details. We left off as the door at the end of the corridor had just exploded and the resulting smoke obscured the view. The fleet troopers turned their faces away. I guess they could have used that visor after all, couldn't they? Through the lifting smoke, troopers clad in white armor push through the door and open fire on the rebel defenders. We see a close-up of a fleet trooper taking a well-aimed shot and how his blaster bolt hits his target right in the chest. But the rebels suffer their first casualty immediately as well, when one of them tumbles in the midst of blaster bolts flying by. More and more white armored troopers enter the corridor and the rebels are falling quickly, with 4 more presumably dead on the ground within seconds. The rest retreat slowly around the corner while firing back at first, then full on running away. The invaders have the numbers and slowly, methodically move in, checking doors before pursuing the fleet troopers. Smoke still hangs in the area where they entered. We look into another corridor, 3 surviving rebels running toward us, C-3PO and R2-D2 in one of the door frames to our left. The rebels pass the droids as we see the pursuers come around the corner in the back. The fleet troopers briefly turn and shoot. As one of them is taken down, the camera switches sides and we see more surviving defenders taking shots, hitting another white-plated enemy in the chest. Our droids cross right in the middle of the corridor and the crossfire from both sides and hurry through a door frame in front of them. They make it through unscathed, but right after they are out of sight, a billow of smoke and sparks of an explosion erupt from the door they just entered, leaving their fate unclear. The rebels flee again under the blaster fire of the attackers as we are taken back to the door they blew up and entered through. 2 white armored troopers guarded on each side, while a third checks on one of his fallen fellow combatants, slightly lifting his helmeted head, but instantly dropping it and standing at attention as a tall, imposing black figure with a mask and helmet of their own and a long black cape enters the corridor. He takes a few steps into the hallway before he stands and looks around at the fallen troopers of both sides. He then goes on marching down the corridor, followed by his troops in an orderly fashion. The scene changes to a darker background and a close-up of R2-D2's, face, I guess. A delicate hand and forearm come into frame from the left, inserting a card, slightly bigger than a credit card, in a slot of the droid. We see C-3PO enter a similarly dark junction of narrow corridors. Through a door behind him, we see the white panels of a main corridor wall. He asks, "R2-D2, where are you?" with a concerned tone, looking to his right and toward us, tilting his head, obviously searching for the other droid. He turns around as he hears a familiar beeping from his left and turns there while the camera changes to his view. There, down another narrow corridor, we see R2 standing with a woman in a white dress with a hood opposite him. She looks around nervously before she reaches down and touches him, probably pushing some kind of button. Keep it in your pants, people. I know how that sounds. C-3PO has spotted them. We see the young woman look in his direction and disappear out of frame. R2-D2 beeps and we see the last frame of C-3PO that concludes our first 5-minute segment. Okay, into the details we go. The white armored attackers entering the ship of course are stormtroopers, the soldiers of the Empire. If you're not that into Star Wars, yet I might add, your chance of recognizing the stormtroopers over the fleet troopers should be quite high. While it might be not as true today as it was back then, stormtroopers are one of the signature things portrayed on Star Wars merchandise like mugs and shirts and whatnot. Let's take a look at their armor. As a base layer, they wear black fabric, but unlike Anthony Daniels as C-3PO, this is also true in-universe. On top, they wear a chest and codpiece with a utility belt. Separate pieces for upper and lower arms and legs, shoes and epaulets, and of course their helmets. I find the helmet somewhat difficult to describe, but here goes. Stormtroopers are not called bucket hats for nothing, so there's your basic shape, a bit of an upside down bucket. It has a tube-shaped air filtration system integrated in the base of the helmet, like a thin neck pillow, if that makes any sense. That gives the lower front part a snout-like appearance. Above that is the so-called frown, roughly where the nose would be. It looks like it might be part of the breathing apparatus as well, but I don't think it's explained anywhere. Other style elements include the grey so-called tears under the eyes, the ears and trapezoids on the helmet's dome, as well as a black stripe on the forehead. The eyes are black, almost triangular lenses. On the upper back of the chest plate there's a square with a circle and 2 vertical lines looking like an O and a Roman numeral 2. On the lower back, the kidney plate to be exact, a thermal detonator is attached, although I don't think these are ever used on screen. Overall, the all-white stormtroopers were supposed to have a fascistic look with their helmets designed to be reminiscent of a skull, something that seems quite obvious in hindsight but I actually never noticed. There are many variants of stormtroopers and later also clone troopers in Star Wars media, and depending how well this podcast is going, I will hopefully get to cover more of them. So they break through the door and start shooting, and the ensuing chaos hides quite a few oddities, inconsistent cuts and goofs. Maybe it's just me, but both stormtroopers and fleet troopers fall quite over-dramatically when hit. There's an argument to be had about what exactly happens in the Star Wars universe when someone is hit by a blaster bolt. Should the bolt go right through, leaving a burnt hole, or does it also push the person back? What changes when you're wearing certain armor, and so on? I don't think this is handled all too consistently, never mind logically, compared to real-world physics, and rather goes by what's needed for the scene or looks good. But if people are hit from the front, they should probably at least fall or fly backward and not sideward. However, that's exactly what the first hit stormtrooper does. One of the rebels also dives to the side, clearly supposed to be hit, but there's actually no blaster bolt that hits him. I suppose they forgot to put that in post-production, although I can't really see how they would have missed that because there are a lot of blaster bolts that would not have been as integral to the scene as this one was. If anyone has another explanation for this, let me know in the comments. But I want to cut the people responsible for the blaster bolt some slack, because it was only indicated by arrows in the footage where those blaster bolts were supposed to be, and this was rather new territory since you don't have the same problems with normal gunshots, because if you're not doing bullet time in Matrix or something like this, you do not usually see bullets, but only their impacts. They also didn't go off when the prop guns actually fired, because it can be seen that the ones carried by the stormtroopers actually do, but there are more blaster bolts added than there are blanks fired. What I want to say is, I think Star Wars is a real masterpiece, but obviously it has its errors and I'll of course keep pointing them out, but rather for the fun of it than to actually criticize. Keep that in mind as I go on. Now, take a look at the background behind the stormtroopers. It's this dark room which I think is meant to be the elevator that leads into the CR-90. There are 2 horizontal intermittent recesses in the wall, which I'm not sure what they do. And you can see different lights, green, red and blue, probably buttons. Now, before the rebels start retreating around the corner, there's one shot where the stormtroopers have a corner of the corridors behind them instead of the elevator. This shot was clearly taken from later in the take because they are back in front of the elevator 2 shots later. The stormtroopers also do not seem to pay much heed to tactic or even safety since they cross each other's lines of fire. And that is only on top of the fact that shooting seems to be especially unsafe in these corridors because blaster bolts ricochet off the walls sometimes. While some impacts result in bright flashes of pinkish light, often blaster bolts come flying from angles nobody could have shot from. And while one could mark that down as errors from the effects people, I found at least 2 frames where ricochet effects can clearly be seen. A little side note concerning the different releases here. I just talked about pinkish flashes of light. Actually, all explosions and even smoke have some to a lot of pink in their coloring. This is if you're watching the DVD version, because they changed the colors from previous versions, as can be seen in the direct comparison with the DEET version, getting rid of a certain yellowish tint in the whites, but also making certain elements pinker than before. This was changed back at some point though, as the version on Disney Plus is closer to the original again. Okay, so moving on. What about that explosion R2 and 3PO walked right into after crossing the corridor? Shouldn't they have been destroyed? Well, it's definitely one of these instances where you shouldn't ask too much about the logic. Movies often show important characters potentially dying just off screen, but then they are fine in the very next scene, although there are different levels of credibility ranging from surviving a severe beatdown with the appropriate injuries to show for it, to surviving an explosion right next to you just to get up with a grim face but no harm done besides a stylish cut on your cheek. On such a scale, our droids actually land on the latter end, because if you watch frame by frame, you'll see that the explosion happens in the very first frame C-3PO has fully vanished behind the door frame, so both droids should be directly where the explosion happens. However, that might not have been the original plan. Firstly, there's obviously a cut before the explosion happens. Remember that it was a practical effect, so the actors had to be out of the way, and a cut was absolutely necessary and can be easily identified by the stormtroopers changing positions in the background. But it could also mean that the scene played out differently and gave the droids more time to get out of the way before, but they cut that part for a faster paced, higher stakes fight. Secondly, we actually know they did in fact cut the droid footage from right after the explosion. I'll get into that a little later. With one of the bright flashes of a blaster shot hitting a wall, we cut back to the destroyed door where the stormtroopers first entered, to meet the villain. And when I say the villain, I mean the villain. This black armored and masked figure coming through the door, of course, is Darth Vader. Though there are other contenders, I think Vader certainly holds a special villain place in the hearts of most Star Wars fans. And not just that, he is also generally thought to be one of the best and most important villains in cinematic history. The American Film Institute published a list in 2003 called AFI 100 Years, 100 Heroes and Villains, listing 50 of each category. It has Vader in the number 3 villain spot behind Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs and Norman Bates in Psycho. Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, is listed as the movie, but it's noted he appeared in multiple others, of course. We already see that he's the real deal when the stormtrooper checking on his fallen fellow immediately stands at attention when Vader enters. There's a little detail when he drops the other trooper's head he previously held. The guy on the ground probably didn't want to hurt his head, so he lowered it rather slowly, showing quite obviously that he's not dead. Also, I guess Vader's entrance worked quite well when the movie first came out, but comparing it to modern movies, it makes me chuckle a bit when he walks in, stops, arms akimbo, and looks around very comically. I imagine a parallel world where little Luke calls dead Vader to his room, where the floor's covered with all the Imperial Lego Star Wars sets assembled, and Vader looks around like that saying, "Good, good. I find your collection to be quite impressive, my son. Uncle Owen and Uncle Ben would be so proud. May the Force be with them." Or something like that. By the way, the stormtroopers boarding the Tantive 4 are not just any stormtroopers. They are part of Vader's very own 501st Legion. Today, the 501st Legion is more than just a fictional battalion of Imperial troops, but there's also a real-life, worldwide organization of that name, which its members are very dedicated Star Wars fans who, on one hand, build highly screen-accurate Star Wars costumes, and on the other hand, wear those to promotional and other events, an activity called trooping, as well as for charity events to support children's hospitals and other social causes. Shout out to them and their work, I'm a big fan of the 501st. Now, finally coming back to our droids, what's the deal here? The woman in the white dress inserting the data card into R2 is of course Princess Leia, who was mentioned in the opening crawl. But how did R2 get here, and why is C-3PO looking for him when they were together when we last saw them? Honestly, while I never really thought about that before, there was always this voice in the back of my head telling me that something felt off about the scene. Again, the answer is simple and simultaneously explains why the earlier explosion wasn't even addressed in any way again. Originally, this scene just played out longer and 3PO got knocked over into a bunch of wires and hence had to look for R2 when he got back to his feet. Part of that footage was repurposed later for the aftermath of the dogfight between the Millennium Falcon and the TIE fighters. Interestingly, the aftermath of the explosion was in the script until the 4th revised draft, but doesn't show up in the shooting script anymore. However, apparently they still filmed it, but then didn't use it for the scene. In contrast, Other scenes, like Luke's introduction parallel to the Tantive 4 battle, still were in the shooting script, although that footage was never used for anything. This just goes to show how many moving pieces there are in such a production and how much can still change when editing rolls around. What rolls around now, however, is the end of this episode. This was the second part of the first 5 minutes of the movie. From here on out, I hope to cover 5 minutes per episode, and we will see how that goes. Thanks for watching. I hope you're still enjoying this in-depth nostalgia ride, or maybe even just started getting warm with it. In any case, please stay around for the next episode. To do so, you should of course subscribe to the channel, and if you want to support me further, you can like and share the video. Tell me in the comments which facts of this episode were news to you and what's your take on 3PO Silver Leg and the whole Mandela Effect affair. Aside from YouTube, you can find all Parsec by Parsec episodes on several of the usual podcast platforms, and myself as Exceedingly Excited on Instagram and at ExceedinglyExcited on Twitter, where I keep you updated whenever a new episode releases. Again, thanks for watching and or listening. Goodbye and take care, my friends, or with the words of the Huts,
Mi ciuscu ancescu, mapa desa.